She arrived with nothing but a worn trunk, a leather notebook, and hands that had built things most men in this town couldn't name. They watched her step off that stagecoach like she'd made a mistake, like the frontier wind itself was trying to push her back the way she came. Nobody offered to help with her trunk. Nobody said welcome. In a town where a woman swinging a hammer was either a joke or a threat, Annika Faulkner was about to become something Ashridge Crossing had never seen before, and didn't know yet that it desperately needed. If you've ever been the stranger nobody trusted, drop your city in the comments below. Like this video and follow along, because this story is just getting started. The stagecoach rolled into Ashridge Crossing on a Tuesday, 2 hours late and smelling of horse sweat and wet leather. It shuddered to a stop in the center of what passed for a main street, a strip of packed dirt flanked by a general store, a farrier's shed, a narrow building with a hand-painted sign reading Alcott's Dry Goods, and a row of structures that looked like they'd been built in a hurry and forgotten about immediately after. Annika Faulkner was the last one out. She stepped down onto the running board, then onto the ground, and she took one moment, just one, to look at the mountains to the north. They were close, closer than she'd expected. The peaks already had white on them, and the sky behind the range had that particular gray-blue color that meant the cold was not coming, it was arriving. She was 26 years old. She'd been traveling for 7 weeks. Her right boot had a split in the sole that she'd repaired twice with pine pitch, and the stitching was giving out again. Her coat was good, heavy wool, double-layered at the shoulders, but it wasn't quite right for this altitude, and she knew it. She reached back into the coach and pulled out her trunk herself. It wasn't a small trunk. It was the kind that required 2 men under normal circumstances, but Annika had developed a method for it, tilting it onto one corner, walking it forward on its edge, lowering it in stages. The driver watched her do this from up top without offering to help, and she didn't look at him, so neither of them had to be embarrassed about it. The trunk landed on the ground with a solid thud. Inside it, 2 changes of working clothes, 1 dress she hadn't worn in 4 months, a set of hand tools wrapped in oilcloth, 3 planes of different sizes, a folding square, a marking gauge, 2 saws, and a leather notebook so full of sketches and measurements and construction notes that the binding had been repaired with a strip of copper wire. She stood with her hand on the trunk and looked at the town. The town looked back. There were maybe 9 or 10 people visible on the street at that moment, a woman in an apron outside the dry goods store, 2 men sitting on a bench outside the farrier's, a boy of maybe 12 perched on a fence post with nothing obvious to do, a couple more figures further down. They were all doing the same thing, not quite staring, but not looking away either. The kind of watching that pretends it isn't watching. She was used to it. In Cologne, they'd watched her the same way when she'd started working for her uncle's building firm at 15. In Vienna, they'd watched her when she'd submitted drawings to a commission that had never considered the possibility of a woman submitting drawings. In Hamburg, they'd watched her load her trunk onto the ship that brought her to New York. And in New York, they'd watched her board the first of 3 westbound trains, and at every stop between there and here, there had been watching. She'd learned that the watching didn't stop. You just got better at moving through it. She picked up her trunk, tilting it back onto one corner, and started up the street. The man at the general store told her there was no hotel in Ashridge Crossing. He said this without looking up from the ledger he was writing in, and then he turned a page and kept writing. She asked if there was a boarding house. He said Mrs. Kettler used to rent rooms but didn't anymore since her husband died. She asked if there was anyone who might have space. He didn't answer for a moment, and then he said, "You'll want to talk to Mercer, maybe. He's got the big workshop at the north end. Puts people up sometimes." He still didn't look up. "Don't know that he'll do it for a woman, though." She thanked him. He didn't respond. Gideon Mercer's workshop was at the end of the North Road, set back from the street behind a fence that needed paint and a gate that didn't quite hang straight. The workshop itself was a large structure, larger than she'd expected for a town this size, but it was immediately obvious that something was wrong with it. The roof had a section missing on the eastern slope, maybe 20 feet by 12. The gap was covered with a canvas tarp that had been nailed down at the edges, but the tarp was already pulling loose on the windward side, and the way the clouds were moving up on the mountain, it wasn't going to hold through the week. She stood at the gate for a moment, studying the roofline. The pitch was good. Whoever had built the original structure knew what they were doing. The main frame was solid, the ridge beam looked true. The missing section wasn't a structural failure. Something had happened to the roof itself. Storm damage, maybe, or a section that had been built wrong and finally given out. She could see the edge of the underlayment from where she stood, and it was in reasonable shape. The problem was the shingles, or the absence of them. She was still looking at the roofline when the door opened. Gideon Mercer was taller than she expected, and thinner. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, and about a week's worth of beard that had passed the point of looking intentional. He was holding the door with his left hand, and his right arm was in a sling. Not a proper medical sling, the kind a doctor would put you in, but a strip of folded canvas looped around his neck and tied at his shoulder. His right hand was visible below it, and the fingers were slightly swollen. He looked at her. He looked at her trunk. He looked at the road behind her, as if checking whether she'd come with someone. "Mercer?" she said. "Yes." "My name is Anika Faulkner. I was told you might have space." He studied her for a moment. His expression wasn't unfriendly exactly, but it wasn't open either. It was the face of a man calculating something. "Where'd you come from?" he said. "Most recently, Fort Junction." "Before that?" "Before that, a lot of places." She didn't say it impatiently, just as a fact. He looked at the trunk again. "What's in it?" "Tools, clothes." "What kind of tools?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he looked back up at the roof. She'd noticed him glancing at it twice during the conversation, and something shifted slightly in his face. "I've got a room in the back," he said. "It's small, one window. There's a cot." "That's fine. I can't pay anything. I'm not asking for pay." He seemed to think about this in a way that made her think he wasn't sure whether that was good news or not. "I've got a daughter," he said. 7 years old, Elsie. She's inside." "All right." She asks a lot of questions." "That's fine, too." He looked at her for another moment, and then he stepped back from the door and held it open. "I'll need the roof finished before the pass closes," he said. "I can't do it myself, not with—" He stopped and lifted his chin slightly toward the sling. "What happened?" "Came off a ladder 3 weeks ago. Shoulder." She nodded. "How much cedar do you have?" "There's a stack in the workshop. Should be enough." "Maybe a little short." "What about the underlayment on the exposed section?" He blinked. It looks okay. I'll check it tomorrow morning." She picked up her trunk. "Is the gate latch the way it is, or is that something you want fixed?" He looked at the gate. It's been like that for a while." "I'll do the roof first," she said, "but I'll fix the gate too." She walked through and he closed it behind her, and the latch caught on the third try. The room in the back was exactly as described. Small, one window, a cot with a wool blanket folded at the foot. There was a hook on the wall and a small shelf, and nothing else. The floor was swept clean, and the window glass was intact, which she noted as a positive sign about the overall state of the building. She set her trunk against the wall and sat on the cot, and listened to the sounds of the workshop on the other side of the partition, or rather, the absence of sounds. The shop was quiet, the tools on their racks, the lumber stacked on the floor, the workbench with its vise and its scattered sawdust. It was a good-sized workshop for a one-man operation, better equipped than she'd expected. On the other side of the main room, she heard a door open and small feet on wood floors. "Papa, is someone here?" Gideon's voice, lower. "Yes, a woman. She's going to help with the roof." A pause. "A woman is going to fix the roof?" "That's right." Another pause, longer this time. "Does she know how?" Gideon's response was too quiet for Anika to make out, but it made the child laugh. A short, surprise sound, like she hadn't expected him to say whatever he said. Anika lay back on this cot and looked at the ceiling. The boards up there were tight and even. Whoever had done this room had known their business. She was asleep in 4 minutes. She was on the roof before the sun came up. She'd assessed the situation the night before by lamplight from the ground, and now she stood on the existing shingles in the dark and ran her hands along the edge of the exposed section to check what she actually had to work with. The underlayment was better than she'd feared. It had held against the weather better than expected, probably because the tarp had deflected most of the direct rainfall, even while letting wind and cold through. The deck boards beneath were sound except for two near the lower edge that had started to cup. She pulled those two boards herself, working by feel in the pre-dawn dark, prying them up with a flat bar she'd kept in her coat pocket. By the time the sky started lightening in the east, she had the deck repaired and the underlayment checked, and she was ready to start laying cedar. The cedar stack in the workshop was good quality, dry, well split, consistent thickness. Whoever had ordered it had known what they were buying. She carried bundles up herself, 2 trips at a time, setting them on the roof and organizing them by length before she started laying. She worked from the bottom edge up, the way you always work. Lowest course first, each successive row overlapping the one below, the exposure consistent, the butt edges aligned. She didn't rush it. Rushing cedar shingles was how you got leaks, and leaks in this climate with the passes closing in 3 weeks were not a cosmetic problem. They were a structural one. She was halfway through the second course when she heard movement in the workshop below, then the small feet on the ladder. She didn't stop working, but she kept track of the sounds. The child was careful on the ladder. She could tell by the rhythm of it, the deliberate placement of each foot. When the small dark head appeared at the roof edge, Anika was already setting the next shingle. "Are you Anika?" the girl said. "Yes." "I'm Elsie." "I know." Elsie pulled herself up onto the roof with more coordination than Anika had expected from a 7-year-old and sat on the existing shingles about 4 feet away. She was wearing a coat that was slightly too big for her, and her dark hair was in 2 braids that weren't quite even. She watched Anika work for a while without saying anything. Then, "Why do you do them in rows like that?" Anika didn't look up. "Because water runs down." Elsie thought about this. "So each one has to cover the gap in the one below? And the one below that?" Another thinking pause. "Why 3 layers?" "So if one fails, you still have 2. "Oh." Elsie shifted her position slightly, angling herself to see better. "Can I hand you some?" Anika looked at her for the first time directly. The girl's expression was open and completely serious. The kind of serious that children put on when they want to be taken seriously, which was a different thing from actually being serious, but wasn't nothing either. "You know which end goes down?" Anika said. "The rough end. Because smooth end up would let rain pool." Anika looked at her for a moment. "Your father teach you that?" "He used to." Elsie glanced down toward the workshop door. "He doesn't really do much teaching anymore, since he hurt his arm." Anika turned back to the shingles. "Rough end down. Don't walk on the ones I've already laid." Elsie handed her shingles for the next hour without being asked twice about anything. A seat. Gideon came out at mid-morning with 2 cups of coffee, which he set at the base of the ladder because he couldn't climb it with his arm the way it was. He called up that the coffee was there. Anika came down and took a cup and stood at the base of the ladder and drank it. He stood a few feet away and looked up at the work she'd done. She could see him calculating. The rows were visible from here, clean, consistent, tight. A trained eye could read the quality in the spacing. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't exactly a question. "Yes." "Where?" "Cologne mostly, some in Vienna, a few other places." He looked at her sideways. Not rudely, but trying to fit something together. "You came a long way." "I did." "Why here?" She drank some coffee. It was strong and slightly burnt and tasted like most frontier coffee she'd had in the last 2 months. "I was heading further west. Heard the pass might close early this year." "It will," he said. 2-3 weeks at most. So I needed somewhere to stop. He was quiet for a moment. "I would have offered you pay," he said, "if I had it right now." "I know." He seemed to want to say something else and didn't. He looked back up at the roof. Elsie was up there still, sitting in the same spot she'd been in before, watching the completed section with an expression of visible satisfaction. "She's been up there since 7, Gideon said. "She's been useful." He looked at Anika, then with an expression she couldn't read precisely. Surprise was part of it, but there was something else. Something that looked almost like relief, which she found unexpectedly sad. "She doesn't have many. She's with adults most of the time," he said, "since her mother died." "When was that?" 2 years ago. Anika looked down at her coffee cup. "I'm sorry." "Yeah." He looked away from her back toward the mountain. She's a good girl. Too smart, maybe. She gets bored. She understands slope and exposure, Annika said. She worked that out in about 10 minutes. He turned back with something that was almost a smile. She told me last week she wanted to be a builder. She's got the instincts for it. He was quiet again. The wind came down off the mountain and moved through the gap in the workshop eaves, and he reached up with his good hand and adjusted the collar of his coat. Mrs. Harmon from next to the dry goods came by this morning, he said. She saw you on the roof. All right. She seemed... He paused. She had some things to say. I imagine. It doesn't bother you. It wasn't a question either, but this time she answered it. It bothered me for a long time, she said. I got tired of it. He looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he said, The coffee's better if you drink it while it's hot. She looked down at the cup. It was already lukewarm. She drank the rest of it anyway. By the end of the first week, she'd finished 2/3 of the missing roof section. The pace surprised Gideon. He'd been in the carpentry trade for 16 years, and he'd worked with journeymen and hired men and 2 or 3 women who'd done finishing and trim work in houses, but he hadn't worked with anyone who laid shingles at Annika's rate without sacrificing the quality. He'd examined her work every evening, running his hand along the rows, checking the nailing pattern, looking at the flashing around the vent pipes. He couldn't find a single bad shingle. He didn't say this directly to her. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because saying it felt like it required acknowledging something larger that he wasn't ready to think about clearly yet. On the 5th day, he came out of the workshop at dusk and found her sitting on the woodpile, writing in her leather notebook. She was drawing something, a technical sketch, precise and detailed, with measurements noted in small, neat handwriting. What's that? He asked. She held it out without hesitation. He took it. It was a drawing of the town's loading platform, the wooden platform at the freight yard where the supply wagons unloaded. He'd been avoiding looking at that platform for 2 months because every time he looked at it, he was aware that 3 of the central joists were badly deteriorated and the whole thing was going to fail under a loaded wagon before spring. He'd been meaning to speak to the town council about it. He'd been putting it off because speaking to the town council about anything required energy he hadn't had since he fell off the ladder. Annika's sketch showed the platform in cross-section, with the problem joists clearly marked and a proposed repair solution detailed in 3 stages. You looked at the platform? He said. I walk that way to the water pump every morning. It's going to fail. The center section will. The outer joists are fine. You could sister new lumber to the bad ones and have it solid in a day and a half. He looked at the sketch for a moment. The solution was correct. It was exactly what he would have done himself, if his shoulder were right and he had the time and the energy. The town council hasn't authorized any repairs, he said. I know. He looked up from the notebook. She was watching him with a calm, direct expression, waiting. Annika, I'll do it in the morning before anyone's up, she said. I've already pulled the lumber I'd need from your stack. I'll replace it at cost once I have the money. The repairs won't take long and nobody needs to see me do them. That's not how it works here, he said. People notice. People will also notice when a freight wagon goes through the floor of that platform and someone gets hurt. He was quiet. I'm not asking for permission, she said. It wasn't aggressive, it was just accurate. I'm telling you because you should know. And because it's your lumber. He looked down at the notebook again, at the clean, precise lines of her drawing. The council meets on Fridays, he said finally. Harmon and Bishop and a couple others. They've been talking about that platform for 6 months. Then they'll be pleased that it's done. Or they'll be angry that a stranger did it without asking. People are often angry about things that help them, she said. I've noticed that. He handed the notebook back. She took it and closed it and set it on the woodpile beside her. I'll replace the lumber, she said again. You have my word. He looked at her for a long moment. She met his eyes without looking away or looking challenging about it. Just straight, like she was used to being looked at and had decided a long time ago not to make it anyone's problem but her own. There's a lantern in the workshop, he said. East wall. The oil's full. She nodded. He went inside. She did the platform repair in the pre-dawn hours of the 6th day, working by lantern light in air cold enough to see her breath. The joists were worse up close than they'd looked from the sketch. The center one was punky all the way through, soft as old bread in the middle, and she had to use a longer sister board than she'd planned. She adjusted the measurement on the fly, cutting the new lumber by lantern light with the kind of precision that only came from having made the same type of cut so many times that her hands knew the angles without her brain having to think too hard about it. She was done and had the platform redecked and her tools packed before the eastern sky started going pink. Walking back past the schoolhouse, she stopped. The window on the south side of the building had been repaired with a piece of board nailed over a broken pane. It wasn't a great repair. The board was warped and there was a gap at the bottom edge that was letting cold air straight into the classroom. She stood and looked at it for a moment, calculating. She went back to the workshop. She found a piece of glass in the scrap pile that was close enough to the right size and a small tube of glazing putty on the shelf above the paint. She was back at the schoolhouse window in 11 minutes. The repair took 40 minutes. She did it quietly, by hand, with the whole town still asleep. She walked back to the workshop in the growing light, her hands cold from the putty, her breath coming in long, visible clouds. At the gate, which hung straight now and latched on the first try, she stopped and looked back down the street. The platform was solid. The schoolhouse window was whole. The sky was going from pink to pale gold. The mountains to the north were white from the ridgeline down to about the tree line. She looked at them for a long time. Then she went inside, washed her hands in the basin, and started carrying cedar up to the roof. By the time the sun was fully up, she had the day's first course of shingles laid. Elsie appeared at the top of the ladder at 7:15, precisely on schedule, with her coat and her uneven braids and her serious expression. She didn't say good morning. She sat down in her spot and studied the new work for a moment. "You did more last night," she said, "after supper. Papa says you did something at the freight yard, too. Repaired some joists." Elsie looked at her. "Why?" It was the same question the girl asked about everything. Why? And the answer was always the same, which was that things needed doing and there was someone who could do them. But 7-year-olds needed the specific version of the general answer, so Anika thought for a moment about how to give it. "Because a wagon would have broken through before spring," she said, "and someone would have gotten hurt. But it wasn't your job." "No." "So why?" Anika set a shingle and tapped it into line with the side of her hammer. "When you walk past something broken," she said, "you have to decide whether you're the kind of person who keeps walking or the kind who stops." Elsie was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then she picked up a shingle and held it out, rough end down. By midday, word had traveled, the way word always traveled in small towns, which was through the cracks in every conversation and the peripheral vision of every person on every porch. The woman at Mercer's workshop had repaired the loading platform. The woman at Mercer's workshop had fixed the school window. In the dry goods store, Mrs. Harmon relayed this to 3 women who were shopping and offered her opinion that something about the whole situation was peculiar. She couldn't specify exactly what. It was just peculiar. In the farrier's shed, one of the 2 men who'd been sitting on the bench said he'd watched her carry those bundles of cedar up the ladder herself, and he'd never seen a woman work like that. The other man said he didn't think that was right. The first man said he didn't know what to think, honestly. The town's doctor, a stout man named Aldrich, who'd been in Ashridge Crossing for 11 years and seen most things, walked past the loading platform at noon, studied it for about 30 seconds, and then went to Mercer's workshop and knocked on the door. Gideon answered. "Your guest fixed the platform," Aldrich said. "Yes. Those joists have needed replacing since May." "I know." Aldrich looked past him into the workshop. "She doing the roof?" "Yes." "How's it look?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "It's good," he said. "It's very good." Aldrich nodded slowly. He looked like he was working out a math problem. "She planning to stay long?" "I don't know." "You should find out," Aldrich said, and walked back down the street. That evening, Gideon made dinner, salt pork and potatoes, and a bread he'd baked 2 days ago that was only slightly past its best. And Anika sat across the table from him and Elsie and ate without speaking much, the way she'd eaten every evening since she'd arrived. Elsie did most of the talking, which covered the deficit. She talked about the roof, about the loading platform, about the school window. She'd examined all 3, in sequence, apparently, during a circumnavigation of the town she'd conducted that afternoon while Gideon thought she was doing her lessons. She described the sister joints on the platform joists with technical accuracy. She described the glazing on the window with the critical eye of someone who would have done it slightly differently. Gideon watched her during all of this and said almost nothing. Anika answered Elsie's questions in the direct, practical way she always did, without talking down to her or inflating her questions into bigger ones. At some point, Elsie asked how you knew when a repair was really good and not just good enough, and Anika said, "You check it twice, then you check it once more after you've slept on it. If you're still happy with it in the morning, it's probably right. And if you're not happy with it, then you fix the part that's bothering you, even if no one else would notice, especially then." Elsie thought about this very seriously and then said, "I'm going to do that with everything from now on." Gideon looked at his daughter and then at his plate. His throat moved once. He said quietly, "Clear the plates when you're done, Elsie." Elsie started clearing the plates. Anika looked at Gideon across the table. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the wall to his left, at nothing in particular, with an expression that was doing a lot of work to stay level. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would improve it. After a minute, she got up and helped clear the rest of the plates herself. The cold came harder on the 8th night. She could feel it in the workshop walls. A new depth to the chill that hadn't been there before. Something that came down off the mountain and settled into the wood like a debt being called in. She lay on the cot in the small room and listened to the wind work at the canvas tarp over the remaining unfinished section of roof, still pulling at the edges, still looking for a way in. 8 days left, roughly, before that section needed to be done. She ran the numbers in her head the way she did every night. The cedar stack, the rate of progress, the weather windows she could expect. The math was tight, but it worked. She'd finish the roof with time to spare if the wind stayed under 20 miles an hour while she was working. The harder question was what came after. The pass would close in 2 to 3 weeks. Gideon had said 2-3 weeks at most. The last stagecoach would leave before that, to get ahead of the first heavy snow. She had enough money to make the passage west. She'd been saving toward the next leg for 4 months. She lay on the cot and looked at the ceiling boards. Tight and even. Someone who cared had put those up. Outside, the wind found the edge of the tarp and lifted it for a second, and the whole workshop groaned once before going quiet again. She closed her eyes. In the morning, she'd check the remaining underlayment before she started shingles. She wanted to look at the west wall junction where the tarp had been pulling. There was likely some moisture intrusion at that point that would need addressing before she worked over it. She was thinking about the junction, about the specific angle of the flashing that would need to change when she fell asleep. The frost came on the 9th morning. Not the heavy kind, not yet, but the thin white kind that coated the grass and the fence posts and the top edges of the cedar stack and made everything look like it had been dusted with powdered glass overnight. Anika stepped out of the workshop at 5:30 and felt it on her face before she saw it. That particular bite in the air that was different from just cold. It was the air announcing its intentions. She pulled on her second pair of wool socks inside her boots and started carrying cedar. The west wall junction had been exactly what she'd expected. A strip of underlayment along the edge had taken some moisture intrusion where the tarp had been pulling. Not catastrophic, but enough that she'd replace that section before laying over it, which had cost her most of the previous afternoon. She'd made up the time by working past dark, finishing by lantern light with her breath coming in clouds and her fingers going stiff around the nail heads. The junction was right now. She'd checked it twice that morning before starting, and then once more the way she'd told Elsie. She was happy with it. She worked through the frost and into the morning, and by the time the town started showing signs of life, smoke from chimneys, the sound of a horse being led out of the livery, the school bell that rang at 8, she'd laid 4 complete courses and was moving into the 5th. Elsie appeared at the top of the ladder at 7:50, 10 minutes earlier than the day before. She was wearing the too big coat and a pair of gloves that didn't match. She sat down in her spot and looked at what Anika had done since yesterday afternoon. "You did the junction," she said. "Yesterday. I looked at it this morning before you came out. From the ground." She paused. "I couldn't see anything wrong with it." "There isn't anything wrong with it." "I know. I was checking." Anika glanced at her sideways. The girl was watching the current course of shingles with that same unsettling seriousness. "Your father know you were out this morning checking my flashing?" "He was still asleep." "Elsie." He sleeps late now, since his shoulder. She said it without particular emotion, just reporting a fact. He used to be up before me. He used to have the fire going before I got up. She picked up a shingle without being asked and held it out. That was before, though. Annika took the shingle. She didn't say anything because there wasn't anything useful to say about it, and Elsie wasn't asking for comfort. She was just saying what was true. They worked in silence for a while after that, passing shingles and setting them and tapping them into line, the rhythm of it settling into something almost comfortable. Hunk. The town council met on Friday, as Gideon had said. Annika knew about the meeting the same way she knew about most things in Ashridge Crossing. Through Elsie, who knew everything that happened within 3 blocks of the workshop because she walked those 3 blocks at least twice a day and talked to whoever she encountered. The council met in the back room of the dry goods store, which meant Mrs. Harmon hosted it, which meant Mrs. Harmon had an opinion about everything that got discussed. Friday morning, Annika was on the roof when she heard raised voices from the direction of the dry goods store. She couldn't make out the words, but she could make out the tones. At least 2 people going back and forth, one voice high and certain, another lower and pushing back. It lasted about 3 minutes and then went quiet. She kept laying shingles. At midday, Gideon came out looking like a man who'd been told something he was still deciding how to feel about. He stood at the base of the ladder for a moment and then looked up. Council meeting ran long, he said. I heard some of it. Harmon wanted to raise the matter of the platform repairs. He paused. She wanted to raise the matter of you doing them without authorization. Annika set a shingle and tapped it. All right. Bishop said the platform was a hazard, and whoever fixed it did the town a service, and the council should leave it alone. He paused again. Harmon didn't agree. What does Harmon want? I don't think she's entirely sure. He shifted his weight. His right hand was hanging loose below the sling now, the fingers less swollen than they'd been. That was something she'd noticed in the last couple of days, the injury slowly starting to give ground. She said something about how the town had its own way of doing things, and outsiders shouldn't come in and change them without asking. That's a reasonable position, Annika said. He looked up at her. You think so? It's her town. People are allowed to have feelings about their town. He was quiet for a moment. You don't sound bothered. I'm not. She laid another shingle. If the platform had failed and someone had gotten hurt, she'd have had a different set of feelings about it. That's the thing about problems that get fixed before they cause damage. The person who fixes them can never prove what would have happened if they hadn't. Gideon stood at the base of the ladder looking up at her. The wind moved through the gap in the eaves above him, and he reached up with his good hand and turned his collar up. Bishop asked me afterward if you'd be willing to look at the town hall roof, he said. It's been losing shingles for 2 seasons. She kept working. When? He didn't specify. I think he was asking whether you'd be willing in principle. Tell him yes. Gideon nodded slowly, like a man watching something happen that he wasn't sure yet was happening. Then he went back inside. The thing about small towns was that they had a membrane. Information moved through that membrane, but slowly and with friction, and it came out changed on the other side. What went in as a foreign woman repaired the loading platform without permission came out a day and a half later as the woman at Mercer's place knows what she's doing. And those were not the same statement, but they weren't entirely different either. The friction had stripped something off and left something else. She started noticing it in small ways. The boy who'd been sitting on the fence post the day she arrived, his name was Callum, she'd learned, 12 years old, too old for the one-room school and too young for most of the work in town, started showing up at the base of the ladder in the mornings. Not every morning, maybe every other morning. He never asked if he could help. He just appeared, and when Annika came down to get more cedar, he'd already picked up a bundle and was standing there with it. She didn't ask him about it, she just told him to follow her up. He was strong for 12 and not afraid of heights, and he learned the handling end of shingle work faster than most adults she'd taught. He didn't have Elsie's instinct for the structural logic of it, but he had a kind of physical intelligence. He understood where his body was in space. He could read what the roof wanted from him without being told twice. On his 3rd morning, he carried up a bundle and then stood and looked at the completed section and said, "My dad says you're going to leave when the pass closes." Your dad might be right. He picked up a shingle and turned it in his hands. Are you? I don't know yet. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the Harmon store needs shelving rebuilt on the back wall. Mrs. Harmon won't ask you because she thinks—" He stopped. "I know what she thinks," Anika said. "Hand me that shingle." He handed it to her. "The shelving, though. It's bad. My mom shops there and she's always worried about the top shelf. It leans forward." "How far forward?" "Far enough that she stands to the side when she reaches up." Anika set the shingle and reached for the next one. "What's the wall behind it made of?" Callum thought about it. "Plank. I think plank." "Is there a stud pattern?" "I don't know what that is." "Ask your mother how far apart the bumps are on the wall when she's standing next to the shelving. The places where the planks are nailed to something behind them." He looked at her with an expression that mixed uncertainty and something she recognized as the early stage of real curiosity. "Why?" "Because if I'm going to fix the shelving, I need to know where to anchor it." He processed this. "So you're going to fix it?" "I didn't say that." "But you asked about the studs." She looked at him. He grinned, not smart aleck, just pleased with himself in the way 12-year-olds were when they caught an adult in something. "Go find out," she said. He went. She did the Harmon store shelving on a Thursday afternoon while Mrs. Harmon was at her sister's house for what Callum had described as a visiting afternoon that lasted about 3 hours every week. She didn't wait for Callum's measurement information because she walked past the store the following morning and stood outside the window long enough to see the shelving herself and make her own estimate of the stud spacing. It took her 2 hours and 20 minutes. She anchored the shelving properly, not just stabilized, but rebuilt the back brackets entirely, replacing the original hardware with a heavier gauge and drilling into the studs at intervals that would hold weight without pulling. She leveled the top shelf. She reinforced the joints at the floor brackets, which were what had allowed the forward lean to develop in the first place. She left before Mrs. Harmon came back. She was almost to this end of the street when she heard Mrs. Harmon's door open behind her, and then footsteps, and then Mrs. Harmon's voice. "Miss Faulkner." She stopped but did not turn around immediately. When she did, Mrs. Harmon was standing outside her store with her hand on the doorframe and an expression that was working very hard to be neutral. She was a stout woman in her 50s, the kind of woman who had run things for so long that the running of them had become part of her physical posture. She looked at Anika for a moment. "You came into my store," she said. "I did." Without asking. "You weren't there to ask." Mrs. Harmon's mouth tightened slightly. "The shelving was my husband's business. He built it himself." Anika said nothing, because she could see where this was going, and she wanted to know which direction Mrs. Harmon was going to take it. "He built it wrong," Mrs. Harmon said. The word seemed to cost her something. "He wasn't a builder, he was a merchant. He did his best." "The main frame was solid," Anika said. "The posts and the top rail, that was good work. I only changed the brackets." Mrs. Harmon looked at her steadily. "I've been standing to the side of that top shelf for 3 years. You don't have to anymore." Something moved across the woman's face, not quite softening, but a giving up of some of the rigidity. She looked down at the door frame under her hand and then back at Anika. "I haven't been welcoming," she said. It wasn't quite an apology. It was more like a statement of fact delivered in a slightly different register than a statement of fact. "No," Anika agreed. "I have opinions about the way things should be done in this town." "I know. I still have them." "I know that too." Mrs. Harmon looked at her for another moment. Then she said, "If you'd needed lumber for the brackets, you should have taken it from my stockroom. There's a bin on the left side when you come in the back." She went inside and closed the door. Anika stood on the street for a moment, looking at the closed door. Then she walked back to the workshop. The roof was 90% done by the end of the second week. She could see the finish line from where she stood. The last section was 3 days of work, maybe 4 if the weather turned difficult, and the remaining cedar was the right amount, almost exactly, which gave her the small satisfaction of a calculation that had worked out correctly in practice as well as theory. Gideon had started coming up to the roof, not to work. His shoulder wasn't anywhere near that. But in the afternoons, when the light was good, he would climb the ladder one-handed and sit on the completed section and watch her work. He didn't talk much during these sessions. Sometimes he asked technical questions about the nailing pattern, about a specific detail of the flashing at the eave. Real questions, the kind a working carpenter asked, not the kind of person asked to make conversation. She answered them straight. He listened. On one of these afternoons, he brought up something she hadn't expected. Callum's father came to see me, he said. She was laying a shingle and didn't stop. What did he want? He said Callum's been spending time up here. He has. Aldrich said his boy was the same age when I first let him help in the workshop. He paused. He didn't say it was a problem. He said his words were something like, "The boy's more interested in getting up in the morning than he's been in a year." She tapped the shingle into line. He's got a good eye. He's been difficult, Gideon said, since he got too old for school. Doesn't fit anywhere right now. His father doesn't really know what to do with him. What does Callum want to do? Gideon thought about it. Build things, apparently. According to Callum. She reached for the next shingle. Then someone should let him. Gideon was quiet for a moment. I used to take on apprentices, he said, before my wife got sick. I had 2 boys in here over 3 years, taught them the basics. He looked down at his sling. I haven't been in a position to do much teaching lately. Your shoulder's getting better. It is. He flexed his fingers, testing. Slower than I'd like. They usually are. He looked out over the town from the roof. The angle gave you a view you couldn't get from the street, the whole spread of it visible from this height, the roof lines and the chimneys and the street running down the middle and the mountains behind everything, white and enormous. When Bishop asked about the town hall roof, he said, there were 3 or 4 other things he mentioned, things that need doing before winter. He paused. I think he was asking, not directly, but asking whether you might stay on and work through the list. Anika set a shingle and didn't say anything for a moment. I have enough money to make the passage west, she said. It wasn't an answer exactly, but it was relevant. I know. I assumed you did. The pass closes in a week and a half, maybe 2. I know that too. She laid the shingle and reached for the next. What's on Bishop's list? Gideon pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and read from it. The town hall roof, 3 sections of missing shingles on the north face. The well housing at the end of Miller Street. The frame was rotting, and the cover had blown half off in an August storm, and nobody had gotten around to replacing it. The livery's east wall, which was bowing outward slightly from a bad sill plate. The bridge crossing on the north road, which had lost 2 deck planks and was being avoided by anyone with a loaded wagon. She listened to all of it. When he was done, she said, the bridge is the most urgent. I know. A loaded wagon tries to cross that in the dark and someone loses a horse, minimum. I know. I'll look at it tomorrow morning. He folded the paper back up. I told Bishop I'd relay the request. I wasn't sure. He stopped. What? I wasn't sure you'd want to stay on. You've been here 2 weeks and the town hasn't exactly been. He stopped again, this time looking like he was trying to find the right word for something that didn't have a clean one. It's been honest, she said. I prefer that to pretending. He looked at her. That's a generous interpretation. It's the accurate one. She set the last shingle in the course and sat back on her heels to check the line. It was straight. People don't trust what they haven't seen before. That's not a flaw. It's a reasonable response to uncertainty. She looked at the completed run of shingles. You prove it over time. That's all. He was quiet for a while after that, looking at the town spread out below them. Elsie asked me last night if you were going to stay, he said. He said it carefully, like he was setting something fragile down on a table. Anika didn't answer right away. She was looking at the last section of unfinished roof, calculating the final few days of work. The underlayment was good. The cedar stack would hold. The weather windows were narrowing, but she had time. What did you tell her? She said. I told her I didn't know. A pause. She said she hoped you would. The wind came off the mountain and moved through the open section, and Anika felt it on the back of her neck, cold and direct. She picked up a shingle. Hand me that one on the left, she said. The one with the cleaner edge. Gideon looked down at the row of shingles beside him, found the one she meant, and passed it over. Their hands didn't touch during the handoff, but it was close. She set the shingle and tapped it into line, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And the wind kept coming, and the mountains stayed white, and the town below them went on doing what small towns do in the late afternoon. Quietly, without drama, just the ordinary accumulation of a day getting done. 3 days before she finished the roof, Callum came up in the morning and worked beside her for 4 hours without asking a single question, which was unusual. She noticed it but didn't comment. At noon, when they came down to eat, he sat on the woodpile with his hands between his knees and stared at the ground for a while. She sat on the other end of the woodpile and ate the bread she'd brought out. Eventually he said, "My dad asked me what I want to do, like what I actually want to do with my life." "What did you say?" "I said I didn't know." He picked at the edge of the wood. "But that's not true. I do know. I just didn't want to say it because I don't know. It seemed stupid to say out loud." She waited. "I want to build things," he said. "Like, seriously build them. Not just help. Actually learn how." He looked at her sideways. "Is that stupid?" "Why would it be stupid?" "Because I'm 12 and I don't know anything." "You know more than you did 2 weeks ago." He looked back at the ground. "Mercer used to take on apprentices before." He stopped. "Do you think he'd—" "Ask him," she said. "What if he says no? Then you know. And you ask again in 3 months when his shoulder's better." She finished the bread. People say no for a lot of reasons that aren't about the person they're saying it to. Sometimes they're tired. Sometimes they're scared of something. Sometimes the timing's just wrong. None of that means you stop asking. Callum was quiet for a long moment. "Did you have to ask a lot," he said, "before people let you work?" She looked at the workshop roof, at the section she'd laid, at the 3 days of cedar that stood between her and the finish. "I'm still asking," she said. "Every place I go, I'm still asking. I just got better at being patient with the answer." He nodded slowly, taking this in the way young people took in things they'd need to carry for a long time before they fully understood them. Then he stood up and picked up his gloves. "Ready?" he said. She stood up. "Pass me 2 bundles from that stack," she said. "The ones on the right. They're drier." He went to get them, and she went back up the ladder, and the morning's work resumed. She finished the roof on a Wednesday. The last shingle went down at 2:30 in the afternoon, and she sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long moment. The full slope of the eastern face complete, tight, and even from ridge to eave, every course overlapping the one below by exactly the right amount. She'd checked the flashing at the ridge cap twice that morning. She'd gone back over the west wall junction one more time, even though she'd already checked it 3 times before. The junction was right. The whole thing was right. She took out her folding square and laid it against the last row, checking the alignment. Perfect wasn't the right word. Nothing built by hand in cold weather on a 30-degree slope was ever technically perfect. But it was good. It was solid in the way that things built with actual attention were solid, which was different from things built fast and called done. She climbed down the ladder. Gideon was in the workshop when she came in, standing at his workbench with a hand plane he'd been working on. The shoulder had improved enough in the last few days that he'd been testing it with light tasks, nothing that required full extension or weight bearing, but enough to let him feel like himself again in the space where he spent most of his working hours. He looked up when she came through the door and read something in her face. "Done?" he said. "Done." He set the plane down and walked outside and stood in the yard and looked up at the roof for a long time. She stood beside him and let him look. The afternoon light was coming at a low angle from the southwest, which was the best possible light for reading the work. It caught every variation in surface, every ridge and gap and misalignment, and showed them without mercy. Gideon stood with his good hand in his coat pocket and his eyes moving methodically from left to right, top to bottom. He was quiet for a full minute. "I can't find anything wrong with it," he said. "There isn't anything wrong with it." He turned and looked at her with an expression that had several things in it at once: appreciation, something that might have been humility, and underneath both of those, something more complicated that she didn't try to name. "I've been doing this work for 16 years, he said. "That's as good a roof as I've seen. It's a good pitch," she said. "Easy to do good work on a good pitch." "That's not why it's good, and you know it." She looked back up at the roof. "The cedar helped," she said, which made him exhale through his nose in a way that was almost a laugh. Elsie came barreling out of the back door at that moment, coat half on and one braid coming undone, having apparently heard them through the window. She skidded to a stop in the yard and looked up at the roof with the same serious, evaluating expression she'd been wearing on that rooftop since the first morning. And then she turned and looked at Anika. "You're done," she said. Done. Elsie looked at the roof again, then back at Annika. Something moved across her face, a child's version of the same complicated expression her father had just been wearing. Are you leaving now? She said. The yard went quiet except for the wind working through the gap in the fence where the latch was. Not today, Annika said. Elsie held still for a moment, processing this. Then she turned and went back inside without saying anything else, which Annika had learned was what Elsie did when she was satisfied with an answer, but didn't want anyone to see that she was satisfied with it. Gideon watched his daughter go. Then he looked sideways at Annika. Bishop came by this morning, he said, while you were working. What did he say? He said the North Road Bridge lost another plank overnight. Wagon coming into town this morning had to stop and go around through the Miller Street ford, which is running high from the rain last week. He paused. He said he'd pay for the lumber if you do the work. She looked at the gate. The latch caught on the first try now, every time. She'd fixed that on day 2 and not thought about it since. I'll go look at the bridge this afternoon, she said. The bridge was worse than the description. It wasn't just the 2 missing planks Bishop had mentioned. There were 3 more that had cracked through along the grain and were sitting in place only because the load hadn't hit them right yet. The stringers underneath were sound, which was the important thing, but the decking was failing in a pattern that told her the original builder had used green lumber, unseasoned, and it had dried in place and split over time. A common mistake. Not a fatal one to fix, but it meant the repair wasn't a matter of replacing 2 planks. It was a matter of redecking the whole crossing. She stood on the bank and looked at the bridge and did the math. Lumber from Gideon's stock and what she could get from the mill at the edge of town. 2 days of work, maybe 3, given the water level and the need to work around it. Hardware from the dry goods store. She walked back to Mercer's workshop and found Callum there, sitting on the woodpile waiting, which he'd started doing on the days she came down from the roof early. Can you drive a wagon? She said. He straightened up. Yes. Does your father have one? Yes? Go ask him if I can borrow it for the afternoon. I need to pick up lumber from the mill. He was gone before she finished the sentence. She went inside and pulled out her leather notebook and started writing out the lumber list. Up. The next morning, she was on the bridge at first light with Callum beside her and a stack of fresh-cut planks on the bank. She'd spoken to the mill owner, a quiet man named Pruitt, who ran the operation alone since his partner left 2 years back. And he'd given her the lumber at cost after she'd spent 20 minutes explaining exactly what she needed and why, which was the kind of conversation Pruitt apparently didn't get often, because by the end of it, he'd offered to deliver it himself. She'd thanked him and said she had a wagon. The bridge decking was methodical work. Pull the bad planks, check the stringers underneath, clean the bearing surfaces, set the new planks, nail them down with the right spacing to allow for expansion. She'd done work like this in a dozen different places, on structures ranging from a footbridge in a German farmyard to a covered crossing in Pennsylvania that had been in service for 40 years. Callum worked the pull bar on the cracked planks without being told how, reading what the work needed from the way she approached it. He'd gotten better at that in the last 2 weeks, at watching and inferring instead of waiting to be instructed. She noticed it without commenting on it, the way you notice things that were working the way they should. They were 2 hours in when Dr. Aldrich appeared on the bank. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the work for a moment, and then looked at the 2 of them. How many planks? He said. All of them? Annika said. He was quiet. Bishop told me you were doing the bridge. He didn't say all of them. The 2 he mentioned were the most obvious ones, but the rest are going the same way. She pried up a cracked plank and handed it back to Callum. Green lumber, original build. It's been splitting since it dried. Aldrich stepped carefully onto the near end of the bridge and crouched down to look at the stringer where she'd pulled the plank. He put his hand on the wood and pressed, checking the resistance. Sound, he said. The frame's fine. Just the decking. He stood back up, creaking slightly in the knees in the way of a man who'd been doing that for too many years. He looked at Callum. Your father know you're out here? Yes, sir. What does he think about it? Callum glanced at Annika for a half-second, then back at Aldrich. He said if I'm going to spend my time doing something, I should at least be learning something. Aldrich made a sound that was approximately neutral. He looked at Annika. The well housing on Miller Street, the one on the list. I know the one. It's not just the cover. The main post on the south side has rot at the base. If the cover goes in a wind, the post goes with it, and the whole frame could come down. He paused. I've been meaning to raise it at the council meeting for a month. I'll look at it when the bridge is done. He nodded slowly, looking at the bridge in progress, the raw new planks sitting in the pale morning light. He seemed to be working something out internally, though what exactly she couldn't tell. You're going to run out of time, he said. The pass closes. The stagecoach leaves 3 days before that. I know the schedule. There's more work here than you can finish before then, even working the way you work. I know that too. He looked at her directly. So what's the plan? She set a plank into position and checked the spacing on each side before she answered. Do as much as I can, she said, in the right order. The most dangerous things first. And the rest? She looked up at him. I'll leave Gideon a written account of everything I've seen. Measurements, materials needed, sequence of repair. Everything detailed enough that he can work from it when his shoulder's right. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That's a good plan. In a tone that suggested it was also a sad one, which she understood but didn't address. He left. She went back to the planks. He said, The bridge took 2.5 days. While she was finishing the final section, she sent Callum to look at the well housing on Miller Street and come back with a description of the south post at the base. How soft the wood was, how far up the rot extended, whether the post was bearing weight on its own or if the frame had settled enough to distribute it. He came back with a surprisingly detailed report that included a stick he'd pressed into the wood at various heights to test the resistance, which told her everything she needed to know about how far up she'd need to go with the replacement post. She finished the bridge at noon and was at the well housing by 2. The south post was as bad as Aldrich had said. She dug down to expose the base and found the rot extended 8 inches below grade. The post was sitting in standing water every time it rained, which was a drainage problem as much as a rot problem. She cut out the rotted section, treated the base of the remaining wood, set a new post section with a proper footing that would keep it out of the water, and repaired the frame connections at the top. She was rebuilding the well cover itself. The original had been a simple flatboard design that collected water and was going to rot out again in 3 years, when she heard footsteps on the street and looked up to find Mrs. Harmon standing 6 feet away, watching. Mrs. Harmon had been different since the shelving. Not warm exactly, but differently cool. The kind of cool that acknowledged something without making a ceremony of it. You're changing the cover design, Mrs. Harmon said. The original design collects standing water. That's what rotted the post. Annika held up the new cover. A peaked design, simple but effective. 2 angled boards that would shed rain instead of holding it. This way the water runs off. Mrs. Harmon looked at it. My husband built the original cover. Annika remembered what Mrs. Harmon had said about the shelving and said nothing, waiting. He built a lot of things in this town, Mrs. Harmon said. 30 years ago when there wasn't much here. He wasn't a craftsman. He just did what needed doing. That's worth something, Annika said. It is. Mrs. Harmon looked at the peaked cover in Annika's hands. That design is better. It should last longer, assuming the drainage holds. Mrs. Harmon looked at the small trench Annika had dug around the base of the post to direct water away from the foundation. You thought of a lot of things. I tried to think of the thing that caused the problem in the first place, Annika said. Not just the problem itself. Mrs. Harmon was quiet for a moment. She looked at Annika in a way that was evaluating but not unkind, like a woman recalculating something she'd been certain about. There are 11 days before the stagecoach leaves, she said. I know. Are you planning to fill all 11 of them this way? Annika set the cover down and picked up her drill. I'm planning to finish this first, she said, and then see what's next. Mrs. Harmon made a sound that might have been approval and walked back toward her store. That evening, Gideon spread Bishop's list on the workbench, and they went through it together, she standing on one side, him on the other, with a lantern between them. She'd already crossed off the bridge and the well housing. What remained was the town hall roof, the livery's east wall, and 2 smaller items Bishop had added since the original list. A section of the school's exterior siding that had blown off in a storm and been replaced with a mismatched board, and a drainage problem behind the farrier's shed that was causing the foundation to undermine. She went through each item methodically, giving her read on priority and approach. He listened and occasionally asked questions, the kind that came from knowing the specific behavior of wood and weather in this particular valley over a period of years. Information she didn't have and genuinely needed. The town hall roof, he said when she got to that item. 3 sections on the north face. The north face gets ice this time of year. If it's still open when the freeze comes down hard. I know. I'd want to do that before the livery wall. The livery wall is more visible, he said. Hargrove's been complaining about it for a year. Complaining about it won't hold the roof up, she said. The wall's bowing, but it's not going anywhere before spring. The town hall roof could let in ice water inside a week. He looked at her across the lantern. You're right, he said. I knew you were right before I said it. Then why did you say it? He shifted his weight slightly. Because Hargrove's going to be angry. He can be angry about the livery wall in a building with a dry town hall, she said. He exhaled. Not a laugh exactly, but in that direction. Fair. She turned back to the list. The school siding I can do in an afternoon, once the town hall roof is done. The drainage behind the farriers is a half day if I can borrow Callum's father's wagon to move the fill. I'll ask. She looked at the remaining items on the list. What am I missing? What do you mean? The things that aren't on the list. Things that need doing that nobody put in writing. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the lantern as if gathering his thoughts. The Aldrich place, he said. The front steps. The third one from the bottom has been soft for 2 months, and Aldrich keeps meaning to replace it and keeps not doing it. He's 63, and if he goes through that step in the dark, I'll do it tomorrow morning before the town hall roof. Gideon looked at her. That's not on the list. No, she agreed. He was quiet again. He had a way of going quiet that wasn't absence. There was something working in it, something he was turning over. She'd gotten used to it in the last 2 weeks without entirely figuring out what it meant. Annika, he said. She looked up from the list. I know what you said to Aldrich on the bridge, about writing everything down before you go. He paused. He told me. She held still. I appreciate it, he said. I do, but... He stopped. His hand, the one not in the sling anymore, the sling had come off 3 days ago, though he was still being careful with the arm, went to the edge of the workbench and pressed against it like he was steadying himself. There are things that writing down doesn't really cover. She waited. Elsie's sleeping better, he said. Since you've been here, she's been herself again in a way she hasn't been. He stopped again. Whatever he was building toward was costing him something to build. And he looked at the wall. I've been in this workshop every night for 2 years doing not much of anything, just sitting in it since my wife died. And now I'm actually working again, and it's because somebody came in here and made it feel like a place where work was happening. She looked at the list in her hands. I'm not asking you to stay, he said. It came out quickly, like he wanted to make sure she heard that part clearly. I don't have the right to ask that. I'm just saying what's true. She set the list down on the workbench. The Aldrich step first, she said. Then the town hall roof. Give me your best estimate of how many bundles I'll need for 3 sections on the north face. He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled the list toward him and started doing the calculation. She did the Aldrich step in 40 minutes before sunrise, working by lantern, the new board cut and fitted and nailed down, and the surface planed smooth before Aldrich came out his front door at 6:15 and stopped on the porch and looked down at it. He stood there for a long moment without moving. Then he went back inside. She'd already gathered her tools and was heading down the street when his door opened again and he called after her. Miss Faulkner. She turned. He was standing on the porch with his coat half on. He looked at her across the distance between them, and then he looked down at the new step, and then back at her. Thank you, he said. It was 2 words, plain, without decoration. She nodded once and kept walking. The town hall roof took 4 days. The north face was steeper than Gideon's workshop roof, and the ice had already begun forming at the lower edge in the mornings, which meant she had to work carefully on the descent each time she came down and equally carefully on the ascent each morning. On the second day, she slipped on a patch of ice near the eave and caught herself on the ridge cap bracket with both hands, hanging for a second with her feet scrambling for purchase, and then got her footing back and sat still on the roof for a moment until her heart rate came down. Callum, on the ground, had gone white. "I'm fine," she said. "You almost—" "I didn't." She looked down at him. "Rope. There's a length of rope in the workshop, east wall above the second window. Go get it." He went. She rigged a safety line for the remaining 2 days, running it from the ridge anchor to a loop around her waist, which slowed her down some, but not enough to matter against the alternative. She should have rigged it from the first day on this roof and hadn't, because she'd been moving fast and estimating the ice risk as lower than it was. That was a mistake. She acknowledged it to herself directly, without drama or excessive self-criticism, the same way she acknowledged when a measurement was off. Note it, correct it, don't do it again. On the 4th evening, she nailed the last shingle into place on the north face and came down and did not slip. The town council met that Friday. She wasn't present for it, but Gideon was, and when he came back, he sat across from her at the table and told her what had happened. "Bishop moved to have you paid for the bridge and the well housing," he said, "from the town maintenance fund." "I wasn't expecting payment." "Bishop said that was exactly why you should be paid." He looked at her steadily. Harmon seconded the motion. She looked at him. "Mrs. Harmon seconded it," he confirmed. She looked down at her hands. There was cedar pitch on the left one, black and sticky, that she hadn't fully gotten off. "There's something else," Gideon said. She looked up. "Bishop asked the council to formally invite you to stay on through winter. Not just finish the list. Stay on as," he used the term town builder, which isn't an official position. There isn't funding attached to it, not yet. But he said the council would work on that. He paused. They voted on it. And 4-1, he said. Harmon voted yes. She was quiet for a long moment. "Who voted no?" she said. "Kettler. The woman who used to run the boarding house." He shifted in his chair. "Kettler votes no on everything. It's not personal." She looked at the lantern on the table between them. The flame was burning steady, not flickering. The draft from the window had settled as the evening dropped the temperature and sealed the gaps. "The livery wall tomorrow," she said. "Annika, I'll go see Hargrove in the morning before I start. Let him know what I'm doing and why, so it doesn't come as a surprise." Gideon looked at her for a long moment across the lantern. The light moved on his face, and he looked tired in the way that had nothing to do with sleep. The particular tiredness of someone who'd been carrying something alone for a long time and had started recently to feel the weight of it differently. "You're going to answer the council's question in your own time," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes?" she said. "I am." He nodded once. He picked up the list from the workbench and folded it and put it in his shirt pocket, which was where he'd been keeping it for the last 4 days. Outside, the wind came down off the mountain and worked through the eaves of the newly shingled town hall, which stood on the other end of the street, tight and dry, and ready for whatever the winter was going to send at it. She listened to the wind find no way through. Hargrove was not an easy man to talk to before 7 in the morning. He was short and broad and ran the livery with the particular intensity of someone who'd built something from nothing and never quite stopped defending it against threats that had mostly stopped coming years ago. He'd been in Ashridge Crossing longer than almost anyone, say, longer than Bishop, longer than Aldrich, longer than Mrs. Harmon, and he carried that seniority in his shoulders, in the way he stood in his own doorway and looked at whoever came to it. He looked at Annika the way he looked at everything, like it was probably going to be a problem. "Mercer sent you," he said. It wasn't a question. "No one sent me. I'm here because the east wall needs attention. I know what my wall needs." "All right," she said. "Then you know the sill plate is compromised and the bow is going to get worse once the ground freezes and heaves. You've got maybe one hard winter before the wall starts pulling the roof connection." He was quiet for a moment. He looked past her at the wall in question. She'd been standing in front of it for 10 minutes before she'd knocked, examining the bow from different angles in the morning light. "I've had estimates," he said, "from 2 men in this town. Both said it was a big job. It's not a small one. What's your number?" She told him what she'd need in materials. She told him the labor was not going to cost him anything, which made him look at her with an expression somewhere between suspicion and offense. "I don't take charity," he said. "It's not charity. Bishop's maintenance fund is covering materials for the town list. Your wall is on the town list." "I didn't put it there." "Bishop did. 3 months ago, apparently." She looked at the wall again. The question isn't whether it gets fixed. It's whether it gets fixed before the freeze or after, and after is a harder job. Hargrove stood in his doorway for a long moment, jaw working slightly, doing the mental arithmetic of a man who wanted to argue but couldn't find the specific angle that would make the argument work. "I'll be in the way," he said finally. "You won't. I'll work around the stalls. I'll need to shift 2 horses to the south side for a day while I'm working the base of the wall, but that's the only disruption. Biscuit doesn't go next to Harmon's mare. They don't get along." "Which stall is Biscuit in?" He told her. She made a note in her leather notebook. "I'll put them on opposite ends," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then he stepped back from the doorway. "You want coffee before you start?" he said. "It's on the stove." She wanted coffee. It had been a cold walk from the workshop. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He grunted and went inside, and she followed him in, and that was how Anika Faulkner and Hargrove began something that wasn't quite friendship, but was significantly better than the alternative. The livery wall took 3 days. The sill plate was worse than the bow had suggested. It had been sitting in intermittent moisture from a drainage issue on the north side, the same category of problem as the well housing on Miller Street, water finding the lowest point and staying there. She fixed the drainage first before she touched the wall itself, cutting a simple channel to redirect the runoff away from the foundation. It was 2 hours of work that would add years to the life of everything she was about to do. Hargrove watched her do it from the livery door. "Nobody mentioned the drainage," he said. "It's why the sill plate rotted," she said. "If I replace the plate without fixing the drainage, you'll be in the same position in 5 years. He was quiet. "The 2 men who gave me estimates didn't mention it?" He shook his head. She kept digging the channel. "Sometimes people only look at what they've been asked to look at," she said. "The drainage wasn't the question, so they didn't answer it." "You weren't asked about it either." "No," she said, "but it was there." He stood and watched her for another minute and then went back to his horses without saying anything else. But that afternoon, when she came down from working the wall to get water from the pump, she found a tin plate with 2 biscuits on top of her tool trunk. No note, no indication of where they'd come from. The biscuits were still warm. She ate them both. On the second day of the livery work, Callum came by after his morning chores and worked the afternoon beside her. He'd started doing this systematically over the past week, showing up wherever she was working, not asking if he was needed, just appearing and picking up the end of whatever task could use another pair of hands. His father had come to find Gideon 3 days ago, not to object, but to ask, with a kind of studied casualness, whether Callum was learning anything useful. Gideon had apparently told him yes, at some length. The father hadn't come back, which she took as acceptance of the arrangement. On the second afternoon, while Callum was handing up lumber for the sill plate section, he said, "Mercer said he might take me on in the spring." She kept working. "He told you that?" "He told my father. My father told me." He handed up another length of lumber. "He said he'd need to see how the shoulder healed, but probably in the spring." "That's good." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment, holding the next piece of lumber without handing it up, looking at the wall. "Do you think he means it? Or is he just, I don't know, saying it to be decent?" She looked down at him. "Did Gideon Mercer strike you as the kind of man who says things to be decent that he doesn't mean?" Callum thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "Not really." "Then he means it." She reached down for the lumber. "He's going to need someone to teach when his shoulder's right. He's a builder. That's what builders do when they can't build. They teach. It keeps them sane." He handed up the lumber. "Did someone teach you?" "My uncle. And before him, my father. And before him, my grandfather built half the houses in his district." She set the lumber and checked the level. "It goes back a long way in my family." "Is that why you do it? Because of your family?" She ran her hand along the length of the new sill plate, checking the bearing surface. "I do it because there's nothing else I'd rather be doing," she said. "The family part is just where it started." He absorbed this. "What happens when you run out of places to go?" he said. She looked up at the sky. The mountains to the north were fully white now from ridgeline to treeline, and the line of white had crept lower in the last week, advancing toward the valley floor. "You stop somewhere," she said, "eventually." He didn't ask the obvious follow-up, which she noted and appreciated. She finished the livery wall on the third afternoon and spent the last hour of daylight walking the fence line on the north side of the property, checking whether the drainage channel was doing what it was supposed to do. It was. The ground was still soft enough to read the water movement, and the channel was directing runoff away from the foundation cleanly. She stood in the fading light looking at the wall, straight and tight, the new sill plate solid, the bow corrected, the roof connection clean at the joint. It was good work. Not flashy, not the kind of work anyone would look at and immediately admire, because the most important part of it was 6 inches underground. Hargrove came out of the livery and stood beside her and looked at it. 3 years ago I had a man price that job, he said. He wanted more than I made in 2 months. Materials are the expensive part, she said. Labor's just time. Not everyone's time is the same. He was looking at the wall the way a person looked at something they'd been worried about for a long time and had finally stopped worrying about. I've been watching that bow since August. You didn't have to watch it much longer. He was quiet. Then, I want to pay you something, not through the council fund, from me. That's not necessary. I know it's not necessary. He said it with a small edge, not angry, just firm. I've been in this town 40 years and I've run an honest business and I pay what I owe. This is something I owe. She looked at him. He was looking at the wall, and his jaw was set in the way of a man who'd already decided something and wasn't interested in being argued out of it. There's a mare I've been keeping for a family that left for the winter, he said. Good animal, sound, well-mannered. They left her in my care, but I've got more horses than space right now. He paused. You'd be doing me a favor to take her on loan through the spring. She looked at him. I'd need a place to keep her, she said. Mercer's got a small stable behind the workshop. It's empty. Been empty 2 years. He glanced at her sideways. I already spoke to him about it. She was quiet for a moment. You already spoke to him about it? Last night, Hargrove said without any particular embarrassment. After supper. She turned back to the wall because she needed somewhere to look that wasn't at him. The mare's name is Dell, he said. She's easy. You won't have any trouble with her. I don't know how long I'll be here, she said. I know that. He looked at the wall one more time, then turned and walked back to the livery. At the door he stopped. Spring at the earliest for that family to come back for her. Probably longer. He went inside. She stood in the cold for a minute, looking at the straight wall and the darkening sky. Then she walked back to the workshop to tell Gideon about the horse. She found him at the workbench, which was where he spent his evenings now, and actually at the bench, actually working. The shoulder improved enough in the last week that he'd been doing light joinery, small repairs, the kind of handwork that required precision more than strength. He was fitting a drawer back into a small cabinet that Mrs. Pruitt had brought in for repair, checking the slide with his good hand while the other steadied the cabinet. He looked up when she came in. Hargrove give you trouble? He said. No, he gave me a horse. Gideon set down the drawer. He told me he was thinking about it. He told me he'd already spoken to you. He came by last night after... He paused. He wanted to make sure the stable was actually empty, and I wasn't just saying it was. Is it in decent shape? Needs some work on the door hardware. I was going to do it this week. He picked up the drawer again and checked the slide. She's a good horse. Dell. Hargrove's run that livery long enough that his animals are well handled. She sat down on the stool near the workbench. You could have told me he was coming to talk to you. I could have. He didn't look up from the drawer. I wasn't sure he'd follow through. You thought I might say no if I knew it was planned. He set the drawer down again and looked at her this time. I thought you might say no if it felt like people were making arrangements around you instead of with you. She looked at him for a moment. There's a difference? I think there is. He turned the drawer over and examined the corner joint. You've been here 3 weeks, and every decision you've made has been yours. You fixed what you saw needed fixing because you decided to, not because anyone asked you to. I didn't want Hargrove to make you feel like you were being maneuvered into something. She thought about this. He wasn't maneuvering me, she said. I know, but you wouldn't have known that until you'd talked to him. She leaned back against the wall. The lantern on the bench threw long shadows across the workshop floor. Outside, the wind was moving, and she could hear the stable door at the back. The hardware was loose. She'd been hearing it for a week, tapping in the draft. The hardware on the stable door, she said. I'll do it tomorrow. I can do it tonight. It'll take 20 minutes. He looked up. Anika. What? He looked at her with an expression she'd been seeing more of in the last week, something between amusement and something more serious that rode underneath the amusement. You've been working since 5:30 this morning. I know that. It's 8 o'clock. I'm aware of the time. The hardware will still be loose tomorrow morning. She looked at him. He looked back at her steadily, with the particular patience of a man who'd decided to hold his position without pushing. Fine, she said. He went back to the drawer. She sat on the stool and watched him work for a while, which was something she'd started doing occasionally in the evenings over the last week. Not talking much, just sitting in the same space while the work happened. It wasn't a thing she'd have been able to explain well if someone had asked her about it. She'd spent a lot of years in workshops and building sites, around people who worked. There was a particular quality to the silence in a room where someone was doing a thing they actually knew how to do. She found it easier to be in than most other kinds of silence. After a while, Gideon said, Elsie wants to learn the mortise and tenon joint. She's 7. She's been watching me do this for 3 years. She knows what the joint is. She wants to know how to cut it. Her hands aren't big enough to control the chisel properly. I know. I told her that. What did she say? She said she'd practice holding it until her hands got stronger. He fit the drawer carefully into the cabinet and slid it in. It moved smoothly. He pulled it back out and examined the edge that had been sticking. She's been squeezing a block of wood every night before she goes to sleep. Anika looked at the wall. She showed me this morning, she said. She didn't tell me why. He looked up from the cabinet. She didn't tell you? No. He was quiet for a moment. Then something crossed his face that she couldn't fully read. It seemed like it might have been the particular emotion of a parent watching their child become someone with their own reasons for things. She's been practicing, he said, more quietly. On her own, without anyone telling her to. She's determined, Anika said. She is. He was looking at the cabinet without seeing it. She was like that before her mother died. She was... He stopped. His hand pressed against the cabinet edge. She was the same way, interested in everything, always at the edge of whatever anyone was doing, figuring out how it worked. He stopped again. She went quiet for almost a year after. The lantern moved in a draft. She's not quiet now, Anika said. No, he said. She's not. He picked up the drawer and slid it in again, checking the movement, and this time he left it in and set the cabinet upright on the bench and stepped back to look at it. The drawer was the only thing wrong with it, he said. The rest of the cabinet is solid. Whoever built it knew the work. It's old, she said. You can tell from the joinery style. 30 years, maybe more. He ran his hand along the top. Things that are built right last. It was a plain thing to say. She wasn't sure if he meant it the way it sounded or only the way it literally sounded. Either way, she didn't answer it, and he didn't seem to expect her to. The school siding took an afternoon as she'd planned, and the drainage behind the farrier's shed took most of a day because the fill material was heavier than she'd estimated, and Callum couldn't come that day. She did most of it herself, which left her with a sore back for 2 days afterward. Not injured, just the particular ache of too much shoveling in cold air. She mentioned the back to no one. By the end of the 4th week, the list Bishop had given Gideon was essentially done. There were 2 small items remaining. A section of fence on the north road that was a safety issue for livestock, and a chimney cap on one of the older houses on Miller Street that had corroded through and needed replacing. And she had those done by the Thursday of the week before the stagecoach was due to leave. That Thursday evening, the town council met again. She was in the workshop when Gideon came back, and she could tell from the way he came through the door, a specific quality in how he moved, careful but not heavy, that something had happened. She set down the plane she'd been using on a piece of trim work she'd been helping him with and waited. He sat down at the bench. They voted to establish a formal position, he said. Town carpenter. Salary from the town fund. Not much, they were honest about that. But a salary. She looked at him. Harmon gave a speech, he said. She talked about the shelving. She talked about the way her husband built things in this town 40 years ago when there was nothing. She said, he paused, she said the town needed someone who built things the way they should be built, not just the way they could be built. She nominated you. The workshop was quiet. Kettler voted no again, he said. Everyone else voted yes. She sat with that for a moment. Kettler always votes no, she said. That's what I told Bishop when he asked if I thought it would bother you. She looked at the piece of trim on the bench. She picked up the plane and ran it along the edge once, checking the line, then set it down. What did you tell Bishop about whether I'd accept? She said. I told him I didn't know. He looked at her directly. I still don't. She looked at the wall across from her. The lamp threw light and shadow on the boards, and the boards were tight and even, the way they'd been the first night she'd lain on the cot and looked up at them. Someone who cared had put those up. She thought about the trunk in the back room, still unpacked, more or less. Her tools were spread across the workshop because she'd been using them, but the trunk itself hadn't been repacked. She'd told herself that was just efficiency. She'd been telling herself that for 2 weeks. The pass closes in 11 days, she said. The stagecoach leaves in 8. 8, she repeated. He was quiet. He was doing that thing he did, going still, waiting, not pushing. She'd come to understand it was a deliberate thing he did, not a passive one. He chose to wait. It took something out of him. She could see that. Gideon, she said. Yes. The stable door hardware. I said I'd do it tomorrow, 10 days ago. He looked at her for a moment. It's still loose. I know. I've been hearing it. She stood up from the stool. I'm going to go fix it now. He watched her pick up the small hardware kit from the shelf on the east wall, the one with the screws and the hinge sets and the hasp mechanism. It's 9 o'clock, he said. I know. You said last time that you were tired. I said I wasn't going to fix the hardware that night. I didn't say I was tired. She moved toward the workshop door. I'll be 20 minutes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, there's a lantern on the hook by the stable door. I know where the lantern is. She went out into the cold. The night was clear and very cold. The sky so full of stars it looked like someone had overturned a jar of salt over a black cloth. Her breath came in long clouds. The stable was at the back of the property, a small structure that she'd assessed in the first week and found to be fundamentally sound. The frame was good, the roof was tight. It just needed the kind of regular maintenance that tended to get neglected when a structure was empty. The door hardware was simple. 2 hinge screws on the lower hinge had worked loose from the frame, and the latch plate was slightly bent. She tightened the hinge screws first. The cold had made the wood contract slightly, and the screws turned down firmly. And then she bent the latch plate back into alignment with a flat bar and tested the latch 3 times until it caught cleanly each time. She stood in the stable doorway and looked out at the yard. The workshop was lit from within, the lantern light showing through the 2 windows. She could see Gideon's shadow moving inside. He'd gone back to the cabinet work, she could tell from the angle and the movement. The light moved when he moved and was steady when he was still. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but she knew where they were from the absence, the place where the stars stopped. The pass was up there. 11 days, 8 days for the stagecoach. She had enough money. She'd been saving for the next leg for 4 months. There was enough for the passage west and some left over for when she arrived, wherever she arrived. Another town where she'd step off a stagecoach and find a place to stay in exchange for work, and begin again the slow process of making herself legible to strangers. She knew how to do that. She'd gotten good at it. She stood in the stable doorway for a while looking at the lit workshop and the dark mountains and the yard between where her boots were. Then she went inside and reported to Gideon that the door hardware was fixed and she was going to bed. He said goodnight without looking up from the cabinet. She went to the back room and sat on the cot and looked at the trunk against the wall. The leather notebook was on top of it. She opened it to the last pages, the ones with the lists and measurements and repair notes she'd been accumulating since week 2, pages of it. Every detail she'd promised Aldrich she'd leave behind, documented so completely that a competent carpenter could work from them without her. She sat and looked at the pages. After a while, she closed the notebook. She did not start repacking the trunk. On Friday, Callum came to the workshop and stood in the yard and called up to where she was finishing the small repairs on the stable roof. She'd found 2 places where the flashing needed attention while she was fixing the door, and said that his mother wanted to know if Anika would come to dinner that evening. She looked down at him from the stable roof. Your mother, she said. Yes. She said to say, he squinted, recalling. She said to say that you've done more for this town in 4 weeks than most people do in 4 years, and the least she can do is cook you a decent meal. Annika sat back on her heels. There's going to be other people there, Callum said. Just to say that up front. It's not just us. Aldrich is coming, the Pruitts, maybe Bishop. She looked at him for a moment. What time? She said. He grinned. He had a good grin, wide and unguarded, the kind that hadn't learned yet to be self-conscious. 6 o'clock, he said. And she said, don't bring anything because last time someone brought something, it was Hargrove, and he brought a jar of preserved meat that nobody touched. All right, she said. He went. She went back to the flashing. Below her in the workshop, she could hear Gideon working at the bench. The sound of the plane moving along wood in long, steady strokes, the way it sounded when the work was going well. She listened to it for a moment before she went back to her own work. The flashing was almost right. One more adjustment at the upper edge, and it would be done. She made the adjustment. It was right. Callum's mother was a woman named Ruth, and she cooked the way some people built things, without showiness, but with a precision that told you she'd done it 10,000 times, and had strong opinions about how it should go. The house was warm and slightly crowded and smelled of roasted meat and something with apples in it. And when Anika came through the door at 6 o'clock, she was met by a room that went briefly quiet before resuming itself, which was the most honest welcome she'd received since arriving in Ashridge Crossing. Ruth handed her a cup of something hot and said, "Sit anywhere that isn't already taken," and went back to the kitchen. Aldrich was there standing near the fire with his usual measuring expression, and the Pruitts, Pruitt from the mill and his wife, a tall woman who shook Anika's hand firmly and said she'd heard a great deal about her. Bishop was in the corner talking to Callum's father, a quiet man named Thomas, who'd inherited his son's physical intelligence without the son's talkativeness. Hargrove was there too, in the chair closest to the door, which told her something about how he felt about rooms full of people. Gideon came in 10 minutes after she did, with Elsie beside him, and Elsie immediately found the only other child in the room, Ruth's youngest, a girl of about 9, and pulled her into a conversation with the aggressive friendliness of a child who didn't get enough social contact and intended to make the most of this one. They ate around a table that required 2 extra boards to accommodate everyone, and the conversation moved the way conversation moved in small towns, when people who didn't usually gather were gathered, circling at first, landing on safe topics, then gradually finding the things people actually wanted to say. At some point, Bishop said across the table, "Miss Faulkner, I hope Mercer conveyed the council's position accurately." "He did," she said. "And have you had time to consider it?" The table went a degree quieter. Not obviously. People kept moving their forks, kept holding their cups, but she could feel the attention shift. "I've been considering it," she said. Bishop nodded, respecting the non-answer, which she appreciated. He was a measured man. She'd come to understand that over the past weeks. He said what he meant and didn't push beyond it, which was rarer than it should have been. "The position's real," he said. "I want to be clear about that. It's not a courtesy. The salary is modest, I won't pretend otherwise, but it's a real salary from the town fund, and it'll grow when the fund grows." He paused. "This town is going to grow. We're at the edge of something here. More families coming through every season. More freight. The road north is going to be properly graded inside 2 years, which means more traffic year-round." He looked at her steadily. "We need someone who can build for what this town is going to be, not just patch what it is." Aldrich across the table said, "That's the longest speech I've heard out of Bishop in 3 years. A few people laughed. Bishop's mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. "The man has a point," Hargrove said from his chair near the door. He said it to the room generally, not to Bishop directly, which was as close as Hargrove came to agreement. Ruth came in with more bread and set it on the table and said, "Let the woman eat before you make her decide things," and that effectively closed the subject for the rest of the meal. She walked back to the workshop alone. Gideon had stayed to help Ruth with something, a stuck window that Thomas had mentioned at the end of the meal, the kind of mention that was really a question, and Gideon had said he'd look at it before he left. Elsie was staying the night with Ruth's daughter, an arrangement that had been proposed and accepted with a speed that suggested it had been planned before the dinner started. The street was cold and clear. The stars were out again the way they'd been the night she'd fixed the stable hardware. The same impossible density, the same absence of mountains where the stars stopped at the ridgeline. 8 days. She walked and thought about that number. 8 days had a different weight now than it had 3 weeks ago when she'd arrived with her trunk on a Tuesday afternoon and studied the gap in Gideon's roof and decided the cold left no room for hesitation. 8 days then would have been 8 days of work, and she'd have measured it in shingles and board feet and the number of courses left to lay. 8 days now measured differently. She stopped on the street outside the workshop gate and looked at the building, the roof she'd built. The light from the window, which meant Gideon wasn't back yet, which meant Elsie had left a lamp burning the way she always did when she went out, which was something that had annoyed Gideon the first time, and now he didn't say anything about it anymore. She went inside. The workshop was quiet. Her tools were on the bench where she'd left them, the plane, the marking gauge, the folding square she'd had since she was 19, and her uncle had pressed it into her hands and said, "Learn to trust this before you trust anything else." The leather notebook was on the shelf where she'd put it after closing it 4 nights ago without repacking the trunk. She sat down on the stool and looked at the notebook. There was a question inside herself that she'd been not quite asking for 2 weeks. The way you didn't quite look at something directly because you were afraid that looking at it directly would make it into something you'd have to deal with. She was not, in general, a person who avoided things. She'd spent her adult life walking toward things other people walked around. But this particular question had a quality she recognized as difficult, which was that the answer involved things she didn't fully control. And she was more comfortable with problems whose solutions were a matter of skill and time. This wasn't entirely that kind of problem. She picked up the notebook and opened it to a blank page near the back. She took out her pencil. She wrote 2 columns without heading them. On the left side, she wrote the things that were on the other side of that pass, the places she'd been going toward for 7 weeks. The work she'd heard about in Fort Junction and before that in other towns, the possibilities that had been the reason she'd pointed herself west in the first place. On the right side, she wrote what was here. The right side took longer to write. When she was done, she looked at both columns for a long time. The left side was real. It was work she could do and places she could be useful. She didn't romanticize what was here, and she didn't diminish what was there. She was trying to be honest with herself the way she was honest about flashing angles and bearing loads, without sentiment distorting the measurement. The right side had Dell the horse. It had a stable she'd fixed. It had Callum, who had a good eye and no one to teach him yet. It had Elsie, who was squeezing a block of wood every night to strengthen her hands for a chisel she didn't have yet. It had a town that had started helping itself, neighbor to neighbor, in small ways that she'd noticed accumulating over the past 2 weeks. Thomas offering Pruitt the use of his wagon, Aldrich stopping to look at the Kettler widow's fence and coming back the next day with tools, Mrs. Harmon leaving a covered plate of food outside the door of a family on the north end who'd had sickness in the house. She hadn't caused any of that directly, but she'd been in the room when the temperature changed, and it had Gideon, who said what he meant and didn't push beyond it, and had learned, was learning, that asking for help was not the same as losing something, who had a daughter who was becoming herself again, piece by piece, and knew it was partly because of Anika and couldn't say so directly, but showed it in everything he did. She looked at the 2 columns for a long time. Then she closed the notebook. She wasn't ready to decide. Not tonight. But she was closer than she'd been yesterday. And yesterday she'd been closer than the day before. And she recognized the direction she was moving in, even if she wasn't quite ready to call it a destination. She went to bed. The trunk stayed where it was. 7 days before the stagecoach, Elsie asked her to teach her to cut a mortise. She came to the workshop after breakfast with the block of wood she'd been squeezing. Anika could see the tooth marks where Elsie had apparently also been biting it, which said something about the level of determination involved, and set it on the bench and looked at Anika with the expression she wore when she'd decided something and was waiting to see if the world was going to cooperate. "Your father said you could try when your hands were stronger," Anika said. "My hands are stronger." "How do you know?" "Because I can feel the difference." She held up the block. 3 weeks ago, I could barely squeeze this. Now I can squeeze it until my whole arm shakes. Anika looked at her. The girl's jaw was set in a way that was her father's jaw exactly, a thing she probably didn't know and would be embarrassed to be told. "Show me your grip on this," Anika said, and held out one of the smaller chisels, a 1/4 inch that was lighter than the standard. Elsie took it. Her hand was small and the chisel was still slightly large for it, but her grip was firm, and she had the instinct to rotate it slightly. Not fully correctly, but in the right direction, which meant she'd been thinking about this long enough to have worked out part of the mechanics on her own. "Where did you learn to hold it like that?" Anika said. "I watched Papa, and I watched you." She looked at the grip. "Is it wrong?" "It's not wrong. It's almost right. Rotate your wrist just a little more toward you. Yes, like that." She looked at the adjustment. "That's the grip." Elsie looked at her hand holding the chisel with a concentration so fierce it was almost funny. "Now what?" she said. "Now you mark your mortise and you cut it. Slowly. This isn't about speed." She spent an hour with Elsie at the bench, guiding her through the marking and the initial cuts. Elsie's first mortise was predictably rough. The walls weren't quite perpendicular, and the depth was uneven. But the concept was there. She understood what she was trying to do, which was the thing that mattered at the beginning. The hands would catch up to the understanding if she kept at it. When they were done, Elsie looked at the rough mortise and the scrap piece of pine and said, "It's not good." "No," Anika said. "It's a first mortise. First mortises aren't good. That's what makes them first mortises." "How many did you cut before yours were good?" "I stopped counting at 50. After that, I just stopped thinking about whether they were good or not, and thought about whether they were right." Elsie turned the piece over in her hands. "What's the difference? Good is about what it looks like. Right is about whether it does what it's supposed to do." She took the piece and slid a tenon into the mortise. Loose, the fit was too loose, but it went in cleanly without forcing. A good mortise that doesn't hold isn't good. A rough mortise that holds is right. Elsie looked at the joint. "Mine's too loose," she said. "Yes, next time you'll cut it tighter." "How do I know how tight is tight enough?" "You cut it a little tight, and then you pare the walls until the fit is right. You feel it when it's right. It resists just enough." She pulled the tenon out and handed the piece back. That's what 50 mortises teaches you. Not how to think about the fit, how to feel it. Elsie held the piece and looked at it for a long moment. "Will you still be here in 50 mortises?" she said. She said it without looking up, very casually, the way children ask the questions they most needed answered, sideways, with their eyes somewhere else so they could pretend they hadn't asked if the answer was wrong. Anika looked at the top of Elsie's head. The braids were uneven again today. They were always uneven. Gideon did them every morning, and he was consistent about getting them in, but not quite consistent about getting them even, which told you something precise about what he prioritized. 50 mortises is a lot of mortises, Anika said. "You're going to need to practice every day." Elsie looked up then. Her expression was careful and very serious. "That's not an answer," she said. "No," Anika said. "It's not." Elsie held the scrap piece and waited. "I'm still deciding," Anika said. "That's the honest answer. I'm still deciding, and I'm not going to tell you something that isn't true just because it would be easier to say." Elsie looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, with a gravity that was too old for her face and exactly right for who she was. "Okay," she said. She picked up the chisel again. "Can I try the mortise again on this piece? The other face?" "Yes," Anika said. "Mark it first. Show me your marking before you cut." Elsie picked up the marking gauge and set it carefully. Tut. 5 days before the stagecoach, the first real snow came. Not a dusting. The first real snow, the kind that fell through the night, and was still falling when Anika came out at 5:30 and found 6 inches on the ground with more coming. The world was muffled and white, and the mountains had disappeared entirely behind a low gray ceiling that was indistinguishable from the higher cloud. She stood in the yard and felt the snow on her face and thought, the pass is closed. Not officially yet. But the pass was closed. Whatever was on the other side of those mountains was on the other side of them until spring, as surely as if a door had swung shut and latched. She stood in the yard for a long time. The stagecoach was still running. It would run its last trip out before the road became impassable, and people who needed to leave had 3 days to do so before that window closed behind them. 3 days. She thought about what she'd written in the 2 columns in her notebook. She thought about the left side of the page. She tried to feel what she felt about it clearly, without the snow and the closed pass doing her thinking for her. It would have been easy, too easy, to let the weather decide. To say the pass closed, the stagecoach was going, the decision was made by circumstance. She didn't want that. She'd made her own decisions her whole life. She wasn't going to stop making them now. She stood in the snow and thought it through. Then she went inside. Gideon was already up, which was new. He'd been getting up earlier again in the last week, the shoulder close enough to write that the sleeping late period seemed to have passed. He was at the stove when she came in, and he turned and looked at her and then looked at her expression, and whatever he saw in it made him set down the coffee pot carefully. "The snow," he said. "Yes." He was quiet. "Gideon," she said, I'm going to need you to tell me something honestly." He turned fully to face her. His expression was the careful, waiting one. "All right. The council's offer, the position." She looked at him steadily. "Is that what you want? Not what Bishop wants, not what the town wants. What do you want?" He held still for a moment, the kind of still that meant he was deciding whether to say the careful thing or the true thing. He said the true thing. "I want you to stay," he said. "I've wanted that for 2 weeks, and I haven't said it because it wasn't my place to say it. The decision is yours, and I didn't want to be another voice telling you what to do with your own life." He looked at her. "But you asked me to be honest, so that's honest." She looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," she said. He waited. "Make coffee," she said. "I want to talk through what the position actually looks like, what the work involves practically, day to day, what the salary covers and what it doesn't, what the arrangement would be here, whether I keep the back room or whether that changes." He looked at her. "Are you—" He stopped. "I'm thinking out loud," she said. "That's what I do before I decide something. I think out loud." She looked at him. "Are you going to stand there, or are you going to make coffee?" He turned back to the stove. She sat down at the table and opened her notebook. They talked for 2 hours. She went to see Bishop that afternoon. He was in his office above the assay building, a small room with a low ceiling and a view of the street that showed the snow still coming down and the town going about its business in it. Horses with their heads down, people moving quickly between buildings, the smoke from every chimney going straight up in the windless cold. She told him she was accepting the position. He didn't make a ceremony of it, which she'd been counting on. He nodded and said he'd have the formal paperwork drawn up by the following week, and they discussed the salary again, and she asked 2 specific questions about the town fund stability, and he answered them directly and without hedging, which gave her confidence in the numbers. Before she left, he said, "Can I ask what decided it?" She thought about the 2 columns in her notebook. She thought about Elsie's sideways question and the way she'd held the chisel. She thought about the dinner at Ruth's house, about Hargrove in his chair by the door eating a meal he hadn't brought preserved meat to. She thought about the snow outside and the closed pass, and the specific fact that she hadn't let those things decide for her. "I decided it," she said. "That's the answer." He looked at her for a moment, and then he almost smiled. "Fair enough," he said. She went back out into the snow. She told Gideon first. Then Elsie, who received the news with the careful non-reaction of someone who had been hoping for a specific answer and had decided in advance that she wasn't going to show how much she'd been hoping for it. She said, "Okay," and went back to the piece of pine she'd been practicing on, and Annika watched her set the marking gauge and thought, 50 mortises. Maybe less if she kept at it the way she'd been at it. She told Callum the following morning, when he showed up at the workshop in the snow with his coat on and his boots not quite tied, which was his standard presentation. He stood in the yard and she told him she was staying on as town carpenter, and he said, "I know," in a tone that suggested he'd been operating on this assumption for days. "You know," she said, "Mercer told me, last week." He looked at her. "He said he thought you were going to stay. He said he could tell." She looked at the workshop roof. Her roof. The lines were clean and tight under the snow, every course doing exactly what it was supposed to do. "What did he say exactly?" she said. Callum shrugged. "He said you hadn't repacked your trunk." She stood there for a moment. "Go get the rope from the east wall," she said. "I want to check the town hall roof after last night's snow. If there's ice at the eave line, we need to know about it." He went. She picked up her toolkit and followed him in. "Ba-chas." A saying. The town hall roof was fine. The flashing held. The shingles she'd laid were keeping their seams tight under the snow load, and there was no ice buildup at the eave because the pitch was moving water efficiently enough that it wasn't sitting long enough to freeze. She walked the ridge and checked all 3 sections and came down satisfied. She stopped at the Aldrich step on the way back. The new board had a good inch of snow on it, and she brushed it off and looked at the surface. Still solid. The fit was right. She pressed her boot against the edge and felt no give. Aldrich opened his door while she was standing there, heading out for his morning rounds, and stopped when he found her on his front step examining the woodwork. "Still good," she said. "I noticed," he said. "Every morning." He looked at her. "I heard you're staying. News moves fast. In this town it moves at the speed of a sneeze." He pulled his coat closed against the cold. "It's good news," he said, "for what it's worth for me." "It's worth something," she said. He nodded and went past her down the steps, testing each one as he went. Not anxiously, just the habit of a man who'd been going down those steps for 20 years and paid attention to them now in a way he hadn't before. She watched him go and then went back to the workshop. Oh, the last stagecoach left on a Tuesday, exactly 1 month after she'd arrived on one. She didn't go to watch it leave. She was on the north road checking the bridge. Another inch of snow had come overnight, and she wanted to look at the new planks under the first real snow load, make sure the nailing pattern was holding, and the planks weren't cupping from the moisture change. They weren't. The decking was flat and tight, and the drainage she'd built into the roadbed on each approach was moving water away from the bearing surfaces correctly. She stood on the bridge and put her weight on each plank in turn, working from one end to the other, and every one of them held exactly as it should. She heard the stagecoach before she saw it, the sound of the horses and the creak of the rigging coming down the north road, heading for the main street and then out the south road and away before the weather made the route impassable. She stepped off the bridge and stood on the bank. The stagecoach came around the bend, moving at a steady pace, the driver hunched against the cold with his hat pulled low. The coach itself was full. She could see faces in the windows, people heading south before winter closed everything down. A woman and 2 children, an older man. One face she didn't recognize looking out at the passing country with an expression she recognized because she'd worn it herself. The expression of someone watching a place they're leaving and not being entirely sure how they feel about that. The stagecoach crossed the bridge without slowing. She listened to the sound of each plank under the wheels. Solid. No flexing, no hollow sound of movement. The coach moved past her without the driver looking over. She was just a woman on the riverbank in the snow, not a passenger, not someone who needed anything from him. He kept his eyes on the road. She watched the stagecoach until it went around the next bend and the sound of it faded. Then she stood in the quiet. The river was running low under a skin of ice at the edges. The trees on the far bank were snow-covered and still. The mountains behind them were invisible again behind the cloud ceiling, the way they'd been since the first real snow, the whole massive range reduced to an absence, a gap in the sky where things ended. She thought about something her grandfather had told her, back when she was small enough that she had to stand on a stool to see his workbench. He'd said, "The problem with people who are good at leaving is that they forget they're also good at staying. It's the same skill. It's just direction." She hadn't understood it then. She'd been 9 years old and more interested in the hand tools than in what he was saying. She understood it now. The direction she'd always been pointing wasn't west. It was toward work that needed doing and places that needed her particular attention and problems that rewarded the kind of careful, patient, repeated effort she'd been making her whole life. She'd been pointing at that from the beginning. She'd just been moving through a lot of geography while she did it. She picked up her toolkit. She walked back toward town. That evening, after supper, Gideon went up on the workshop roof. She saw him from the yard. He'd gone up the ladder one-handed still, being careful with the shoulder, which was nearly right, but not quite. He had 2 cups of coffee, one in each hand, and he set them on the ridge while he climbed and then picked them back up at the top. She stood in the yard looking up at him. "You're going to spill both of those," she said. "I didn't spill either of them." He held them up as evidence. "Come up." She climbed the ladder. They sat on the completed roof in the cold, side by side, with the town spread below them and the sky above pressing down gray and close. The snow had stopped for the evening. The chimneys were all going, and the smoke rose and spread in the still air and lay over the town in layers, and the lantern light from the windows made the snow on the street glow faintly orange. He handed her a cup. She took it. She could see the bridge from here, the North Road Bridge with its new planks, and the town hall with its tight north face, and the well housing on Miller Street with its peaked cover, and the loading platform and the school and Hargrove's livery with its straight east wall. She could see the lights in Ruth's house and Aldrich's house and the window of Mrs. Harmon's place above the dry goods store. She could see all of it from here. The stagecoach left today, Gideon said. I know, I watched it cross the bridge. He looked at her sideways. How was the bridge? Good, she said. Every plank solid. He nodded and drank his coffee. They sat for a while without talking. It was an uncomfortable silence. It was the other kind, the kind that had stopped needing to be filled because both people in it had stopped performing. She'd noticed it developing over the last week, this particular quality in the silence between them. She didn't try to name it. Naming it would have been beside the point. Elsie cut her third mortise today, he said, while you were at the bridge. I know, she showed me when I came back. What did you think? Better. The walls are getting more consistent. She drank some coffee. She's got the patience for it. That's the thing you can't teach. He was quiet for a moment. Her mother had it, the patience. He looked at the town below. I don't have it. Not like that. I rush things sometimes. Always have. I've seen your work, she said. You don't rush things. The work I do right, no, but other things. He turned the cup in his hands. It took me 6 months to go see the doctor after I hurt my shoulder. 6 months of that canvas tarp on the roof and not being able to work properly, and I just kept thinking it would get better on its own. He looked at his right hand, the one that had been in the sling when she'd arrived. It wasn't getting better on its own. Most things don't, she said. No. He looked at her. They need someone to actually do something about them. She looked at the view, the town below, the lights in the windows. I had a conversation with Bishop today, she said, about the spring work, the road improvements he mentioned, the ones coming through. He wants someone involved in planning the drainage before the grading starts. If the drainage isn't right, the road work will undermine itself inside 2 seasons. That's true, Gideon said. I told him I'd put together a proposal before the end of winter, so the council has time to act on it before the ground thaws. She drank the last of her coffee. I'll need someone who knows the water table in this valley, how it behaves in the spring thaw, where it comes up. That's knowledge you don't get from looking at the ground. He looked at her steadily. I know the water table. I know you do. He was quiet. I'd need your shoulder to be right by spring, she said. Not right enough. Actually right. Which means you need to stop pretending it's further along than it is and actually do the exercises Aldrich told you to do. He exhaled slowly through his nose. He told you about the exercises. He mentioned them, she said, in passing. In passing, he repeated in a tone that suggested Aldrich's passing mention had been more than passing. Are you doing them? A pause. Most of them. All of them, she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him without any particular expression, the way she looked at a measurement she needed to be accurate. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked away, and she could see the corner of his mouth move. All of them, he said. Good. She set her empty cup on the ridge between them. Then you'll be useful in the spring. He made a sound that was definitely almost a laugh this time. Useful, he said. Is that what we're calling it? She looked at the town below. Mrs. Harmon's light was still on above the dry goods store, which meant she was doing her accounts, which she apparently did every night regardless of the hour. Callum asked me today if you were really going to take him on in the spring, she said. What did you tell him? I told him to ask you. He's not going to ask me, Gideon said. He's 12. He's terrified. He's not terrified. He's careful about things that matter to him. She looked at Gideon. Ask him. Don't make him do it. You were 12 once. You know how this works. He was quiet for a moment. I'll ask him this week. Tomorrow, she said. He looked at her. Tomorrow, he said, conceding it. You're not going to be easy to work with, are you? I told you when I arrived that I don't explain myself much, she said. That was about the room, not about... He gestured, a loose motion that encompassed the roof and the town and the situation generally. It applies to most things, she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the cold, with the smoke from the chimneys spreading above the town and the snow on the rooftops catching what little light was left in the sky. His face had changed over the past month. Not dramatically. He was still the same man who'd opened the door with a canvas sling and an expression that was calculating something. But the calculation had changed quality. There was less defense in it, more of something else that she was going to take her time about understanding. "Annika," he said. "Yes." He looked at her and she could see him doing the same thing she'd been doing, measuring something, checking the fit, deciding whether it was right. Not good. Right. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. That was all. Plain, without decoration. The true thing, again, instead of the careful one. She looked at the town below them, at the work she'd done that was holding up under its first real winter, at the lights in the windows of people who had started trusting one another in small ways that would grow over time, the way all things grew that were built on something solid. She wasn't a person who cried easily. She hadn't cried in a very long time. She didn't cry now. But she felt something that was in the general neighborhood of it. Not grief, but its opposite. The particular feeling of having found a place where the weight you'd been carrying was the right weight for the ground beneath you. She thought about her grandfather's workbench. She thought about her uncle's hand on her shoulder the first time she'd cut a mortise that was actually right. The fit resistant and exact, the way it should be. She thought about all the places she'd been in the years between that workbench and this roof. All the work she'd left behind her at different points on the map. Good work, solid work, work that was still standing. She thought that work was real. It mattered. And this is also real. And it matters too. Not every place you fixed and left was a place you were supposed to stay. And not every place you stayed was a place you'd found by knowing from the beginning that it was home. Some of them you found by staying until the question of leaving stopped making as much sense as it once had. Some of them found you while you were busy laying cedar shingles in the dark before anyone else was up, doing work that needed doing because you were the person who could do it. And that had always been reason enough. She picked up the empty coffee cups from the ridge. "The stable door is definitely latched tonight," she said. "I checked it before I came up." "I know," he said. "I heard you check it. The latch is solid. It just needed the right screws in the right places." He looked at her sideways with the almost laugh that had become one of his regular expressions in the past 2 weeks. The one that lived just below the surface and came up when she said something that was about exactly what it sounded like, and also about something more. "Most things do," he said. She climbed down the ladder. She went inside and set the cups by the basin and washed them and put them back on the shelf. She went to the back room and sat on the cot and looked at the trunk against the wall. She opened it. She took out the second change of working clothes, the one dress she hadn't worn in 5 months, the extra pair of wool socks. She took out the oilcloth wrapped tools that didn't need to be in the trunk anymore because they had a place on the workshop bench. She put the dress on the hook on the wall. She put the socks in the drawer on the small shelf. She set the empty trunk in the corner. The leather notebook she kept on the shelf, where she'd been keeping it. The folding square her uncle had given her she set on the window ledge, where the morning light would catch it. She sat on the cot and looked at the room. Small room. One window. Hook on the wall. The ceiling boards tight and even, someone who cared having put them up a long time ago. She was home. Not because the past had closed and taken the choice away from her. Not because staying was easier than going. But because she'd stood in the snow on the riverbank that morning and watched the stagecoach cross a bridge she'd built with sound planks that held under the weight of everything on them, and she'd known, clearly, without sentiment distorting the measurement, that there were some places you passed through and some places you passed into, and that the difference between them was not the place but what you were willing to put into the ground there. She'd put a great deal into the ground here already. She intended to put in more. Outside the workshop, Ashridge Crossing settled into its first real winter night. The snow stopped. The air went very cold and still, and the town held together under it the way things hold that have been built right. Not perfectly, but right. The roofs kept the cold out. The bridge stood over the frozen river. The well cover shed the weight of snow off its peak sides. The shelving in the dry goods store stood square against its wall. The doctor's front step was solid under his boot every morning and would be for years. And in a small workshop at the north end of town, a woman put the last of her things away and lay down on a cot and looked at the ceiling boards and was still.